Sonic the Hedgehog on the original Sega Genesis was the very first video game I ever played, and since picking up that controller for the first time, I've never been the same person. My 6-year-old mind was blown by this new form of entertainment because it wasn't as mindless as watching TV or as simple as playing a board game. It was a digital, interactive adventure that completely immersed me in the colorful landscapes and kept my instincts at the ready to get Sonic through each level to defeat Dr. Robotnik at the end. Actually, that was the hardest part for me in the beginning. For the first few months, I could just barely get through the first 3 acts of Green Hill Zone, never mind when it came to face Dr. Robotnik. I would always lose, getting in a few hits, but failing to recognize the pattern and falling victim to his wrecking ball time after time after time again. For one reason or another, this frustration of losing to Dr. Robotnik so consistently gave me the inspiration to create a good luck charm that would superstitiously aid in my gameplay skills. Since there were virtually no Sonic toys in existence at this time in my childhood, I had to do the same thing to Sonic that I did to Gumby a couple years earlier. And that was sculpt my own. Just like my video game skills in 2003, my sculpting skills were at about the same level when I sculpted my very first Sonic. At the time I thought this was the best clay figure I had ever made, but of course nowadays we can see it's far from it. The very first thing I tend to notice is the ultimate failure to understand depth. When looking at the artwork for Sonic 1, Sonic clearly has 3 spikes on his back and a long outward-facing muzzle. However, this is only what it looks like from a side view, and with me not understanding depth, I tried converting the side view 2-dimensional shapes into a 3-dimensional body and utterly confusing myself as to why it didn't look like the box art. And nowadays, thinking about how confused and impaired I was to the concept of shapes and depth on a 3D surface is really funny. I also wonder why I used colors that were so dark and unlike the character. The only reason I can think of is that perhaps I was running out of clay since his legs are a completely different shade of blue than everything else, or maybe I just didn't have the brighter colors around to begin with. He's also missing the white lines on his shoes and he doesn't have any fingers in his gloves. The shape of his eyes is very accurate though, and maybe it is the most accurate detail of the entire clay figure. We all have to start somewhere, and this Sonic was the very beginning of a long, long road full of Sonic sculpts which improved little by little every time. After Sonic 1 and 3, I got a GameCube where I finished up the classics on Mega Collection. And after that, everything changed. At the time, I had no idea how much validity or charm Sonic Adventure 2 Battle had in the Sonic franchise, and it looked awesome. I watched the City Escape demo before I actually played, and I particularly remember the way I noticed Sonic. It was so strange to see 6 spikes on his back, when I always thought he only had 3, and his movement was so smooth and fluid, nothing like the small little pixelated transitions in 16-bit. I was definitely fascinated by such a drastic transition of graphics, and of course I could spend all day talking about how this game is my favorite Sonic game and in my opinion the best game of the entire franchise, but given my immense praise for it, it was only natural I would take the time to sculpt a dedicated Sonic. Upon first glance, you probably wouldn't think much of this little Sonic clay figure. He's small and relatively simple, especially for SA2 standards. Yet this guy has consistently stood as the evolution point from when my depth-confused and ill-proportioned models changed into the golden standard of how Sonic sculptures should be constructed. Even models from this past year have been influenced by this guy. The biggest breakthrough with this guy is that he's a full 3D model, exactly as he's built in the game. His nose is where it should be and his muzzle is flat. Plus he has all 6 spikes which are correctly placed on his head. Although, I don't think this sculpture was sculpted correctly on purpose. Like, I didn't look at my old one and say, I didn't sculpt that right. I just took a good look at Sonic Adventure 2 and my brain sculpted what it saw. Aside from the sculpt itself, I think this Sonic is one of the most overlooked Sonics in my entire clay collection because he's old and not very detailed, especially if you get into the nitty-gritty specifics of the SA2 style. As I said though, he's without a doubt one of the most important Sonic models that I've ever made. Now we're going to go to an older Sonic game, and one that the critics haven't been particularly nice to. That game of course is Sonic R, the spin-off foot race title for the Sega Saturn that upon first thought brings up people making fun of the game's soundtrack and the Tails doll creepypasta. I hadn't even heard of this game until I played it in Sonic Gems collection in the late 2000s, and my opinion of the game nowadays is exactly the same as it was back then. I liked it. By no means is it one of my favorite Sonic games, or even on my list of favorite Sonic games, but for the little obscure spin-off game that it is, I have no issues with it. The controls were never a problem since I played it on the GameCube. I actually enjoyed the soundtrack and thought it was interesting to hear vocals in a Sonic game as old as that one. And of course, my favorite feature of the game were the obscure characters included. Metal Sonic, Metal Knuckles, Egg Robo, Super Sonic. It was like a less coveted Sonic the Fighter's character roster, and I enjoyed that. So I created a clay set based around the Sonic R cast, but one model in particular, Sonic, led the way for innovation and stands as an evolutionary point to not only the Sonic R set, but also to my Sonic sculpts as a whole. In comparison to the previous two models I've shown you guys, there should be something about the Sonic R1 that visually jumps out right away. And that's the style of the sculpt. While these two other models were based off of their own games specifically, I was not using any sort of reference picture when I made them. It was just a blind sculpt. Sonic R Sonic, on the other hand, is, to my knowledge, the first Sonic I ever made to directly be replicated from the artwork belonging to a game. In the late 2000s is when I began using artwork for all my sculptures, but I particularly think I started with this Sonic due to his easy to sculpt blocky shapes and simple posture. You can even visibly see the joint lines in the hands and the legs where I connected the clay in replication to how the artwork looked. Though the eyes are perhaps the most accurate feature on this sculpture out of everything, because they are just about as true to the artwork as they can be, whereas the limbs I mentioned earlier are a little too thick. The spikes are a bit of an oddity because I was running out of clay and had to make a decision, either sculpt 3 spikes and make them cone shapes, or sculpt 6 spikes but make them flat. I went for the latter, and while it still looks nice, it's not perfect, which at the time I thought was acceptable. Even though this is clearly the best looking Sonic so far, I still can't help but be hard on myself. It's like the issue before was just trying to get the proportion and depth right, but now the issue is sticking 100% to the artwork's appearance. For its time, I really shouldn't be complaining, as this is the first in regards to following official artwork, and I still really like how this Sonic dictated how the rest of the set should appear, and without him, who knows when or how I would have begun sculpting with artwork in mind. If you thought that Sonic R was the most obscure game I was going to bring up in this video, think again. There's another obscure game that brought about another key evolution point in my history sculpting Sonic models, and that game is Sonic Drift 2, originally released on the Sega Game Gear. Back when I first discovered the game in Gems Collection, I remember thinking it was a cool novelty, but nowadays I'd probably never play it. In fact, I'm starting to wonder why I chose so many obscure Sonic games to make sets for, like Sonic the Fighters, but I think it comes down to one thing: the equally obscure characters in those obscure games. Before the Sonic the Fighter set in 2006, I never sculpted a Bean, Bark, or Fang before, and sets like Fighters, R, and Drift 2 exposed me to the new characters that I wouldn't have otherwise sculpted on their own. So likewise, this is the Sonic from the game. It's interesting to note that the Drift 2 set was never completed and I never officially revealed any of the models, so including this Sonic as an evolutionary sculpture is sort of a miracle. But as is expected for being 3 years after the Sonic R model, this guy is perhaps the best Sonic I've ever sculpted out of the clay that I didn't have to paint. So there's something quite unique about this model that is totally different from the other three, yet still encompasses their features. What I'm talking about is the Sonic Drift 2 artwork. Rather than converting the appearance into a more three-dimensionally shaped model, I decided to intentionally sculpt it flat. All of his spikes are pushed up against his back in a more 2D style, while his muzzle and nose are also in the right place. So it's interesting to see this type of dimension, even though it has been 7 years since the original was sculpted. Aesthetically, the colors also resemble the artwork almost perfectly, and the stance of course is spot on as well, arguably a huge improvement over the Sonic R likeness to his artwork. Still, I consider this one of my cleanest and most polished pre-colored Sonic clay figures to date. I wonder how the evolution line would have changed if Sonic was one of the characters that was never sculpted. So far we've seen pretty large gaps of time in between each of these models, and while every one of them came with improvements, there was still a lot of inaccuracy to them. It was just how young and inexperienced I was with clay at the time, and it was only natural that it would take me longer strings of time to build up technique. However, in 2011, the year I believe to be 10 years from when I first began sculpting anything, the skill gap in between the Sonic Drift 2 Sonic and the next sculpture is perhaps the smallest between any two of my sculptures. In just 1 year's time, I turned this into this. We're heading back into Sonic Adventure 2 Battle with what I call my Master Sculpt Sonic. The first difference I want to point out between this model and all the other models I've shown so far is that he's actually been sculpted out of white clay and then was painted afterwards. This was my first successful attempt at creating a painted Sonic of which I think he's colored perfectly. In fact, by accident, the blue paint I was using didn't spread so smoothly, so it created this sort of bumpy texture which I personally think makes the sculpture a million times better and realistic looking than if the paint had dried correctly. Additionally, his eyes and shoes have been glazed for a shiny appearance. And technically speaking, his shoes aren't the soap style, but more a style that was seen in the beta of SA2. I also needed to make him stand out with a more unique pose, something that would be a challenge for myself, but also something that would capture the SA2 style. Somehow I ended up with this fast-paced running pose, of which the floor is actually painted like Crazy Gadget from the game. Now who would have thought this little guy to have been the precursor to something as epic as this one? Similar to how we ended back at Sonic Adventure 2 for the previous model, we're going to end right where we started with this 6th and final model for the video. We've come totally full circle, and I swear I didn't plan this, I have no idea how it happened, but we're going to head back into the original Sonic on the Genesis for one more fight with Dr. Robotnik. The year is 2014, and unlike my gaming skills 11 years earlier, I'm a full pro now. I can complete Sonic 1 in little time and with all the Chaos Emeralds in hand. While the game is pretty straightforward for the most part, that's not to say there aren't those tricky levels like all of Labyrinth Zone and most of Scrap Brain Zone. The same rule can be applied to my clay. While my skills since sculpting my first Sonic in 2003 have increased exponentially, that's not to say there aren't those tricky moments of having difficulty making a certain shape look right or making sure everything connects together so the model can be assembled and completed. In 2014 I was going to participate in a local art fair and sculpt some exclusive pieces to sell there. I tried focusing on popular game characters that I thought would sell, like Sonic. However, out of all the characters I planned to sculpt, Sonic was the only one to get finished. Since I couldn't show up to an art fair with only one piece to sell, I decided to keep that Sonic for myself. And boy am I glad I did, because this Sonic stands as the realized ambition I had for my original sculpture 11 years ago, and to lose him would be like the missing link to the evolution line. Without a doubt, this Sonic stands as one of the few peaks of my sculpting career, consistently topping lists of my favorite, best, and most accurate sculptures, and of course is a standard to how accurate I want all of my sculptures to look in relation to their official artwork counterparts. The shapes, the color, the accuracy, the Sonic style, everything I could want in a Sonic sculpture is contained right within this one, and it's amazing to look at. Sometimes I can't even believe I was able to get in all those little color shades or detail lines into where I did get them in. And in a certain regard, it seems like it would be beyond my skill. But perhaps that's one of the rewards of sculpting, getting better and improving with every model you make. The same way that playing a video game for the first time is not the easiest thing in the world to do. You have to learn the game and practice each level until you become a master at it. Neither of these tasks can be done overnight. It takes dedication, attitude, and lots of rings to make the perfect sculpture, defeat Dr. Robotnik, or continue to make a mark in gaming as one of the industry's most iconic characters 25 years later. Keep on running, Sonic the Hedgehog.